You're lying in your own bed, maybe in a warm apartment, maybe with the glow of a phone screen in your hand, and far away in time there is another bed, a lumpy straw mattress cramped under a low smoky ceiling, in a city that does not yet know it will become a symbol, a battlefield and a legend. In the early 1700s, Boston is not a postcard or a painting on a museum wall. It is a cramped wooden town clinging to the edge of a cold harbour, a peninsula of crooked streets and chimney smoke and church bells, filled with people who wake every morning, not knowing if this day will bring them bread, frostbite, a new baby, a new tax, or a sudden funeral. They have no idea that later generations will call this colonial America or the cradle of liberty. They just call it home, and they are busy trying to survive it. Tonight we're going to slow that world down until you can almost smell the tar and salt on the air, until the mud of the streets and the creak of the floorboards feel familiar, until the idea of waking up in 1700s Boston feels less like a history lesson and more like a strange, vivid memory. We're going to follow the rhythms of a day, how people slept, what they ate, how they worked, how they stayed warm, how they gossiped, prayed, drank, and worried, long before anyone knew there would be a revolution, long before the words United States meant anything at all. If these long, quiet walks through the past help you unwind at night, a like or a subscribe really does help more than you'd think. And I'm always curious where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. So if you feel like it, drop your city and your local time down in the comments. But for now, just settle in. Unclench your jaw, let your shoulders drop, adjust your blanket or your pillow, and let your breathing fall into that slow, easy rhythm you get when you're about to drift. Because Boston in the 1700s could be loud and brutal and chaotic, but we're going to move through it gently, like a camera gliding over rooftops at dusk. So, let's go back. The lamps and LED screens of your room fade away, and in their place you have firelight, tallow candles, and the faint glow of a cloudy winter sky. The year we'll drop into is somewhere in the middle of the century, after Boston has grown out of its tiny Puritan beginnings, but before the streets fill with red-coated soldiers and angry crowds, a time when everyday life is already hard enough without politics making it worse. The town holds maybe 15 or 16,000 people, huddled on a narrow finger of land sticking out into the Atlantic, all wood and brick and chimney smoke, with the harbour pressing in on three sides like a cold, dark moat. We'll start the way most days start for ordinary people, in the half-dark of a small room, in the chill hour just before dawn, when the fire has burned low, the water in the bucket has a skin of ice on top, and you wake up because the cold has crept all the way through your blanket and into your bones. You are not a famous name in any future history book. You are not a governor or a minister or a fiery orator with pamphlets to your name. You are just Daniel, the son of a cooper who died too young, a rope maker's apprentice living in the north end of Boston, in a boarding house that smells of smoke, damp wool, and other people's lives. You are 20 years old. Your hands are already permanently rough from hemp fibers and tar. And tonight, like every night, you went to sleep in the same clothes you worked in, because there is no point in changing if the room is this cold. When the story settles on you, the first thing you are aware of is sound. The soft rasping snore of the boy in the corner who shares your room, the tiny crackle of a coal giving up the last of its heat in the hearth downstairs, the faraway boom of surf somewhere out beyond the harbour walls, and, fainter still, the bell of one of Boston's churches marking the hour. It is too early, you think, even before you are fully awake, but your body is so used to this routine that it starts moving on its own, even while your mind would happily stay in the dark. You roll on the mattress, and the straw inside shifts with a dry, whispering sound. Some of it jabs through the worn ticking and scratches your skin, but you stopped noticing those little stings months ago. The blanket over you is a coarse, thin wool, heavy with the smell of smoke and human sweat and years of winters. You pull it back and the cold hits you properly, not as an idea but as a physical thing, a sharp bite on your cheeks and hands and the tip of your nose. You see the faint white cloud of your breath in the dim light leaking in through the small warped window pane. Ice has formed along the inside of the glass overnight, delicate ferns of frost climbing upward, and for a moment, still half asleep, you think it looks almost beautiful. There are 3 of you in this room. You on your straw mattress near the wall, Amos on his bunk beside the window, limbs sprawled, mouth open, snoring like a saw, and Thomas on a pallet, shoved under the sloping ceiling where the roof comes down low, curled into himself for warmth. None of you has washed properly in weeks. You all know it, and no one mentions it. Bathing, in the sense of taking all your clothes off and immersing yourself in water, is something you've maybe done once or twice in your life, usually in summer, usually in the harbour, and even then someone's aunt will shake her head and mutter that getting soaked like that is a good way to let sickness in through the skin. In winter you settle for wiping your face and hands with a damp cloth when you can, and you hope for the best. The room smells of sour wool, stale sweat and chamber pot, but that too has become a background note you don't really register unless you stop to think about it. You swing your feet to the floor, and the cold of the bare boards goes straight through your stockings. The wood creaks under your weight, and you know from long practice which boards to avoid so you don't wake Mistress Hardin, the widow who runs this house and claims she can tell exactly who is stepping where by the sound alone. You reach for your coat, stiff with yesterday's sweat and flecks of tar, and pull it on over your shirt and waistcoat, then grope for your boots in the half-dark fingers numb and clumsy. When you push your foot down into the leather, the chill wraps around your toes like ice water and you hiss under your breath. But there's nothing to be done about it. There is no warm pair waiting by the fire, just these solid cracked and yours. There is no thought of washing. Not now. There is no thought of a leisurely breakfast or a quiet few minutes with coffee and a newspaper. Coffee is rare and expensive, and mostly a luxury for merchants and gentlemen. Newspapers cost money and time, and you have very little of either. The morning meal, if there is one, will be simple. A piece of yesterday's coarse brown bread, if Amos hasn't finished it in the night. Maybe a scrap of cold salt pork if you are lucky, washed down with small beer from a shared jug. The beer is not a treat or an indulgence. It is simply what everyone drinks, because the wells in Boston are shallow, and the privies are everywhere, and too often the two are not as far apart as they ought to be. You know, in a vague, practical way that water can make you truly sick. Sick in a way that empties a household in a week, and you know more clearly that the weak, low-alcohol beer that goes down with every meal is safer. So today, as on most days, you tilt the jug, feel the lukewarm liquid hit your stomach, and let the sour, yeasty taste pull you the last few inches into full wakefulness. Downstairs, the main room of the house is barely warmer. The hearth holds a few glowing coals, banked overnight under ashes, and Mistress Hardin is already there, wrapped in shawls and an old cap, coaxing the fire back to life with practiced movements. She nods at you, but does not waste words. She has a dozen lodgers to worry about, water to haul, porridge to stir, and probably a small army of worries that she never speaks aloud. The price of flour, the cost of wood, the rumour that another British ship has arrived with more taxes wrapped in its orders. The cold outside is different from the indoor cold, cleaner, and somehow larger. It smells of the harbour, sharp salt, damp wood, rotting seaweed, and beneath it all a deep tarry note that seems to seep into everything. The sky is still grey. Dawn is only just beginning to think about arriving. The streets of the North End are narrow, crooked lanes squeezed between leaning wooden houses, their upper stories jutting forward as if they are peering down at you. Light leaks from a few cracks in shutters. Somewhere a baby is crying. A dog barks once and then curls back into whatever warm spot it has found. You pick your way carefully. The street is not paved here, only churned earth frozen into hard ruts and ridges, with patches of ice where yesterday's slush has refrozen. In warmer weather there would be puddles of foul water and worse, a mixture of animal dung, spilled chamber pots and kitchen waste, but this morning the filth is locked up in ice and snow, and the smell is dulled by the frost. You know, in the easy, unthinking way of habit, which corners to avoid, which alleyways are where the taverns empty their refuse, where the butcher sometimes dumps offal, and where the snow drifts deepest between the houses in a nor'easter. Ahead, the town slopes gently down toward the harbour, and even at this early hour there is movement there. Boston lives and dies by its port. Ships are the beginning and end of most fortunes here, and so the waterfront is awake before the rest of the town. You can hear, faintly, the shout of a sailor, the thud of something heavy dropped onto a deck, the faint scrape of a boat against a wharf pile. Somewhere a gull screeches and another answers, arguing over a scrap. As you walk, you pass other figures, moving in the same direction or crossing your path with the quick, purposeful stride of people who have work to get to and very little margin for error. A woman with a shawl pulled tight over her head and a basket on her arm, heading to the market before the good cuts are gone. A boy of 10 or 11 with a bundle of kindling on his back, cheeks red with the effort of carrying it. A black man in a coarse linen shirt and a short worn jacket, walking a pace behind a plumper, better-dressed white merchant, carrying a leather bag and the man's cloak. You do not know if he is enslaved or free, only that he walks as if the line between those two states is very narrow. Boston is a Puritan town in its origin, but it is also a port, and the ships that bring molasses and sugar and rum do not come empty. People are bought and sold here quietly in counting rooms and on docks, and their labor is another invisible thread in the web of daily life that most white apprentices like you are taught not to look at too closely. You turn toward Long Wharf, that great wooden finger thrusting out into the harbor, lined with warehouses and counting houses and ships tied up side by side. The air here feels different, more open, the wind running along the planking and cutting through your coat. Beneath your boots the timbers creak faintly, and through the gaps you can see the dark water below, slapping against the piles. Lanterns hang at intervals, their weak yellow light pooling on the snow-dusted boards, and between them the shadows are thick. Men move in those pools of light, like figures in a dream. A pair of sailors rolling a barrel, a customs official in a better coat than you've ever owned, shrugging deeper into his collar, a cart horse steaming in the cold as it waits to be hitched. At the base of the wharf stands the long, low building that is your world for most of every day. The rope walk, from the street it looks like nothing remarkable, just an unusually extended shed of rough boards and small windows. But inside it is a strange, elongated universe of fibre and sweat and monotony, stretching further than your eyes can easily measure when you stand at one end and look down the length of it. Rope cannot be made in short bursts. It must be spun and twisted along its entire length, and so this building runs like a line drawn across the townscape. More than 1,000 feet of sheltered labour. You duck in through the door, and at once the air changes. It is still cold, but the chill here is mixed with other smells, raw hemp, dusty and fibrous, hot tar from the great cauldrons where finished rope will later be dipped and waterproofed, sweat old and new, and the faint sour tang of the lunches that will be unwrapped at midday. The light comes in through the row of glass panes along one wall, grey and thin, throwing long pale rectangles across the floor, and catching in the drifting dust that hangs in the air. Men are already at their stations. Some you know from the boarding house, others only from this long hall. A few are older, journeymen with 7-year apprenticeships behind them, and scars on their hands that tell stories you've never heard. Others are younger, boys of 12 or 13, just learning how to feed the fibres into the spinning frames without tangling them. There is laughter in snatches, but it is tired and mostly for show. Most of you are still half asleep. The master, Mr. Gray, moves along the line with a watchful eye, nodding here, correcting a grip there, already wrapped in an invisible cloak of worries, orders to fill, shipments to make, the price of hemp in London, the rumours of new duties on imported goods, and always, always the risk of fire in a building like this. You take your place near the spinner, where the long process begins. In front of you is a pile of raw hemp, rough and pale, like a heap of dry grass, that has been combed and combed until the fibres lie mostly in the same direction. Your job is deceptively simple. Feed those fibres into the spinning mechanism in a steady, even flow, while your hands twist and guide them, so they join into a continuous strand, neither too thick nor too thin, without weak spots that might break under strain. The work settles over you like a familiar weight. Your fingers know more than your conscious mind does about the exact feel of the fibers when they are right, the way they resist, and then yield as they twist, the slight change in tension that means you need to add more or less. Your shoulders begin their slow, endless dance of reaching, pulling, adjusting. Your feet shift as you move along with the strand, step by small step, following the growing rope down the length of the walk. The rhythm takes over: twist, feed, step, breathe, twist, feed, step, breathe. At first, your thoughts are still loud, bumping into each other. A snatch of conversation you half heard about a new law on paper coming from London. The memory of Mistress Hardin's pinched mouth as she counted coins last night. The passing glimpse of that boy with the load of kindling, thin wrists sticking out of his sleeves. But after an hour, maybe less, those thoughts start to blur. Manual labor, done for long enough, becomes its own kind of narrow, meditative tunnel. Your body keeps going, your hands do exactly what they must, and your mind drifts to the edges, hovering in that strange empty space between boredom and focus. Around you, the rope walk has its own soundscape. The low murmur of men's voices, rising and falling, the creak and whir of wooden drums and wheels, the occasional shout of warning when someone carries a coil of finished rope through the narrow lane and needs others to move aside. Farther down near the tar cauldrons, there is the occasional hiss and bubble as hot pitch clings to the surface of a new cable, sealing it against the sea. If you listen closely, under all of that, there is a deeper rhythm, the steady beat of many feet moving up and down the long building, a human tide that flows with the length of the rope and then ebbs back to begin again. This is your morning. While ministers are revising sermons in their study, while merchants are tallying figures in ledgers and deciding which ships to insure and which to risk, while wealthy women are directing servants and poor women are beating rugs in the yard or stirring pots of corn mush over small fires, you are here, twisting fibers into lines strong enough to hold a ship at anchor in a winter storm. You will spend most of your daylight hours inside this long wooden tunnel, in air that is always a little dusty, always tinged with tar, always humming with the effort of other people's bodies. Outside, Boston is beginning to wake up fully. Shopkeepers are opening shutters, sweeping thresholds, arranging goods on rough wooden counters, candles, soap, flour, second-hand clothing, nails, hinges, imported cloth, maybe a few precious books for those who can afford them. Carts are starting to roll along the wider streets, wheels bumping and clattering over the rough surfaces, horses snorting and stamping, vapor rising from their nostrils. Bells ring from several churches as the sun lifts higher, calling people to morning prayers. Not everyone goes, but everyone hears. In some houses, children are being sent to fetch water, wooden buckets banging against their knees as they walk. In others, women are kneading bread or feeding logs into stoves and fireplaces, planning how to stretch the day's ingredients into something that will fill more stomachs than it ought to. For now, though, that world is on the other side of these long walls. In here, the day narrows to work, to the feel of hemp against your palms, to the dull ache building in your forearms, as you repeat the same motion again and again. Somewhere down the line, Amos is cursing softly as a strand snaps and he has to splice it. Further along, an older man with a limp is humming a psalm tune under his breath. Mr. Gray pauses by you once, checks the twist of the rope with a practiced squeeze, nods without a word, and moves on. Time stretches. The dim grey at the windows brightens, and then turns almost white as the sunlight reflects off patches of snow outside. Your stomach begins to remind you that beer and stale bread are not much of a breakfast, but the noon meal is still a ways off. Sweat prickles at your neck under your shirt, even in the cold. The effort warms you from the inside out, so that when a draft sneaks in under the door and brushes across your ankles, you hardly feel it. This is what daily life looks like for you, and for hundreds of other apprentices in Boston. Long, repetitive hours of physical labor that turn raw material into the things that make the town function. Rope, barrels, shoes, nails, sails, candles, flour, while someone else owns the tools and the finished product and most of the profit. Your pay is small, your lodging is cramped, your future is uncertain, but the work has its own quiet, stubborn dignity. You are good at this, you tell yourself as your fingers move almost faster than you can see. And in a world where so much is out of your control, being good at something solid and necessary is no small comfort. Later, when the bell finally rings for the midday break and you step out into the cold light, blinking with the smell of tar still clinging to your clothes, Boston will present to you with its other faces: the crowded marketplace, the gossip and arguments in the taverns, the harsh inequalities on display in every street, the way ordinary people snatch small pleasures and moments of rest from a life that is often short and hard. But for now the day is still young, the harbour wind is still sharp, and the long rope behind you is the clearest, most tangible proof that this morning has meant something. We'll follow you out into those streets after you've eaten. We'll listen to what people say over their ale and their porridge. We'll step into kitchens and counting houses and cramped one-room dwellings, where families sleep 5 to a bed and hang their laundry above the heads of visitors. But that will be the next part of our walk through 1700s Boston. Around midday, when your shoulders feel as if they have turned into knots, and your fingers ache along every old blister line, the bell at the far end of the rope walk rings, and the sound moves down the long hall like a wave, rolling over the clatter of work until one by one the wheels slow. The mutter of voices rises, and men begin to straighten their backs and let their hands fall still. The sudden quiet inside is almost as loud as the noise was a moment before, and for a few strange heartbeats you are aware of nothing but your own breathing, and the faint ringing in your ears from the steady grind of the morning. Lunch is never a feast, but it is a pause, and pauses are precious. Some of the men simply sit on coils of finished rope, pulling bread and cheese from their pockets, talking in low voices about nothing in particular. Others step outside to stretch their legs and let their eyes remember what distance looks like. You are one of those who always leaves the building if there is a chance. After hours in the dim, fibrous air, the hard winter light, even when it is cold, feels like a kind of medicine. Outside, the harbour has shifted into its daytime mood. The sky is higher now, a pale, washed-out blue with thin clouds stretched across it like worn cloth, and the water is a slate-coloured expanse broken by the dark hulls of ships at anchor. On the wharf itself, everything feels more crowded, more urgent. Carts rattle past laden with barrels and crates. Sailors in patched coats hurry along the planks with coils of rope over their shoulders. A clerk stands outside a counting house, going over a list with a captain who keeps glancing toward his ship, as if every minute on land is an insult to his life at sea. Your stomach reminds you that it is not interested in the view, and would like its share of attention. You find a spot at the edge of the wharf, sit on a low bollard and unwrap your meal. A heel of dense brown bread, dark with rye, and a little bitter, and a strip of cold salt pork that glistens faintly in the weak sunlight. The pork is tough, salty enough to sting your tongue, but it is fat and protein, and you eat every bite. The bread is harder to chew than you'd like, grains and bits of husk scraping your gums, but you wash it down with a few swallows of small beer from a shared jug, and feel the heavy lump of food settle in your belly with something like gratitude. Around you, men are doing the same, each in their own way. One sitting alone with his back against the wall, eyes half closed, as if the feel of the sun on his face is as important as the food. Another perched on a barrel with 2 others, trading jokes and insults about whose wife snores the loudest. A group of sailors sharing a pipe, passing it between them with practiced motions, the blue-grey smoke curling up into the cold air. Over the water, you can hear hammers ringing as some poor soul works on repairing a hull in dry dock, each metallic strike carrying in the thin winter atmosphere. From here you can see a slice of the town rising up from the harbour. The roofs are a patchwork of shingles and snow, chimneys leaning at odd angles, narrow lanes vanishing between the houses, like streams between rocks. You know those streets intimately, not in the way a surveyor would, with neat lines and measurements, but in the way your feet do, where the cobbles begin near the center, where they give way to churned dirt at the edges, where the ground dips and puddles in spring, where a corner always smells faintly of fish because someone has hung nets there for as long as you can remember. Somewhere up there in those cramped houses and workshops, Boston's women are halfway through a day that started before yours. At dawn, while you were still pulling on your stockings, many of them were already stoking fires, breaking the thin ice in the water bucket, mixing cornmeal with a little molasses to make mush, checking the bread dough that had been rising overnight in a warm spot near the hearth. Their work is a different kind of relentless, one that never has a bell to signal a break. If you followed one of those narrow alleyways up from the harbour, pushed open the door to a small wooden house, you would step into a world where heat and cold live side by side. The hearth would be the centre of everything, fire burning low even at midday as a pot of something simple bubbles, beans and salt pork perhaps, or a thin stew of whatever scraps could be spared. Clothes hang near the flames on poles or lines, trying to dry. A child sits on a low stool near the warmth, carefully shelling peas or picking over dried beans to remove the stones. A woman, maybe your mother, if she were still alive, or someone like her, is moving from task to task in a quiet circle that never quite closes. She has already hauled water from the pump in the street, sloshing heavy wooden buckets through the cold. She has already emptied the chamber pots into a pit, or carried them to a place where the waste can be taken away, trying not to breathe too deeply. She has scrubbed at shirts and aprons with harsh lye soap in a tub that makes her hands crack and sting, and now she is mending a stocking by the light of the window, needle flashing in and out of the wool. She is not alone in the house. Even the poorest homes are rarely empty. There may be a grandmother in the corner, shawl wrapped tight, fingers stiff with age, still shelling, still mending, still telling a child for the 100th time not to put their hands so close to the fire. There may be 3 or 4 children or more, sharing a straw mattress in a sleeping loft, a tangle of legs and hair and hand-me-down clothes, some running in and out, others already old enough to help with chores that would look like work to your eyes, but are just called what needs doing to theirs. In wealthier homes the rhythm is different, but the work is just as present. Larger rooms, higher ceilings, more windows, yes, but also more linens to wash, more meals to prepare, more silver to polish, more fires to tend. A merchant's wife might not scrub the floor herself, but she will direct the servant who does, and if that servant is ill, or has run away, or has been sold, she will take up the bucket and the rag without much ceremony, because in the end the floor still needs to be clean. Her afternoon might include teaching her daughters to sew neat, tiny stitches along a seam, or to dance a simple figure in case there is a winter assembly in town, and to move in both worlds at once, the world of scraped knees and burnt bread, and the world of manners and social calculations where everything from the fabric of a dress to the way one holds a teacup can be read as a sign. Children's days are their own small universes inside this larger one. Poor boys might be apprenticed early, leaving their mothers' homes at 10 or 12 to live under the roof, and the rules of a master, like you did. Their mornings look like yours now, their bodies learning the shapes of new tools and new obligations. Poor girls often stay closer to home, woven into the household economy, fetching water, helping with washing, minding younger siblings, maybe taking in spinning or mending work if an extra coin can be earned that way. Some children, though fewer than modern ears might expect, go to school, crowding into one-room schoolhouses where a single stern teacher presides over a chaotic ladder of ages and abilities. Boys practice their letters on hornbooks, tracing the shapes carefully, memorizing prayers and passages from the Bible, drilling themselves on lists of kingdoms and rivers they will never see. Girls may sit on the same benches in some places, or may learn at home, sewing sampler alphabets into linen as they go, their stitches half education and half decoration. The schools are not gentle places. A boy who daydreams or fidgets too much might feel the sting of a willow switch across his knuckles, might stand in the corner on aching legs while the class recites. Literacy is valued here. This is still a town with a Puritan memory. where every man is expected to read his Bible and understand the laws that govern him. But that does not mean the learning is easy or kindly. Beyond all of this, threaded through the houses and lanes, there is another part of Boston's daily life that most white apprentices like you see only from the edges. The lives of the black men and women who live and work here, some enslaved, some free, many caught in a space where the lines blur. You see them in the market, selling fish or fruit from baskets on their arms. You see them in the kitchens of the great houses on Beacon Hill, carrying plates in and out of dining rooms you will never enter. You see them on the wharf, unloading barrels under the watchful eye of an owner, or rowing a small skiff between ship and shore. Their days are often longer than yours, their choices narrower. An enslaved woman might start work long before the master's family wakes, baking bread in an oven that makes the kitchen feel like summer even in January. Then move on to sweeping, polishing, sewing, laundering, cooking, until long after everyone else has gone to bed. An enslaved man might spend the day driving a wagon, carrying heavy loads from the harbor to outlying farms, or working in a shop without ever being paid his own wage. At night they might gather in cramped quarters, perhaps in a corner of a cellar, perhaps in a small room behind a shop, sharing stories and songs that carry memories of other places, other names, other lives. All of that is part of Boston's midday, though the men on the ropewalk break and the merchants at their desks might not think of it as such. Daily life in the 1700s is not one story, but many running alongside each other, intersecting in doorways and at wells and in the spaces where money, labor, and need meet. When the bell rings again, pulling you back to the ropewalk, the sun has shifted slightly westward, and the light on the harbor has softened from harsh silver to something a bit warmer, though the air is still cold enough to make your breath steam. You stand, brush crumbs from your coat, and feel your muscles protest as you straighten your back. Lunch is over, and the afternoon is waiting with open hands. Back inside, the second half of the day feels heavier. Your arms tire more quickly, and the dull ache in your shoulders settles in like a permanent resident. The air seems thicker now, filled with more dust as fibers float free with every twist and pull. Someone starts a low song at the far end of the hall, a work tune with a steady beat that your hands can follow, and a few voices pick it up here and there, not loudly, but enough to weave a thread of sound through the long space. The words are half in jest, something about a rope that will hang a particularly hated tax collector, but the refrain is simple and rhythmic and helps the hours pass. Outside, Boston's afternoon goes on. In the market near Faneuil Hall, women haggle over the price of turnips. Fishwives shout their wares in voices hoarse from years of salt air and shouting, and a butcher wipes his knife on a stained apron between customers. A small crowd gathers around a travelling peddler who is set up with ribbons and strange little trinkets laid out on a cloth. He holds up a mirror with a polished metal back and swears it comes all the way from London, that any woman who looks into it will appear a queen. Children giggle and jostle each other for a closer look, and their mothers watch with fond, tired eyes, weighing the silliness of the object against the hard fact of their purse. In the narrow alleys, women hang laundry on lines strung between windows, shirts and shifts and stockings swaying slightly in the cold air. Smoke curls from chimneys and from low cook fires in yards. The smell of boiling cabbage mingles with that of frying fish and bread baking, creating an aroma that is somehow both comforting and slightly sour. A cart rattles by bearing a load of firewood, the man driving it, calling out prices in a practiced chant. A woman steps out, apron dusted with flour, to argue that last week it was cheaper, and he shrugs and talks of shortages and the cost of hauling logs in from further and further away, as the forests retreat under the blade. At the edges of town, where the houses give way to fields and pasture, another kind of work is underway. Farmers who have brought in goods to sell in the morning now tend to horses and oxen, checking harnesses, tightening knots, preparing to head back before the light fails. Children gather chips and dry dung for fuel, their fingers going numb under thin mittens, their breath puffing in pale clouds. Somewhere a dog barks at a crow, indignant, and is ignored. You do not see all of this directly as you twist hemp in the long wooden hall, but you feel it somehow the way the town hums around you like the faint vibration of a ship's hull in the water. Boston is small by future standards, but dense with lives, each one moving through its own set of tasks and worries under the same pale winter sky. As the afternoon wears on, tiredness shifts in your body from sharp discomfort to a kind of heavy numbness. Your fingers seem to move on their own now, with the reflexive precision of a habit learned so deeply it no longer demands attention. With that numbness comes a peculiar clarity. You find yourself thinking not in sharp spikes the way you do when something sudden happens, but in long, slow curves. You think about the way the rope in your hands will one day be hauled across a deck you will never see, about the way a boy on that ship will rely on its strength without knowing your name. You think about your mother's hands, how they once kneaded dough and smoothed your hair, and how your own hands now carry a different kind of strength in their calluses. You think about the streets you walk every day, and how much of their life goes on behind doors you have never opened. When the light outside begins to fade again, turning the windows into rectangles of dull pearl, the bell rings one last time, and the rope walk slowly disengages itself from the day. Tools are put away, cauldrons banked, loose fibers swept into piles for later use. Mr. Gray walks the length of the building, checking locks and making sure no stray spark hides in a corner. A rope walk fire would not just take the shop, it could leap from building to building in this crowded wooden town and ruin a dozen lives in a single night. Fire is a constant companion here. Warmth, light, cooking, yes, but also fear, just one forgotten coal away. You step outside into the early evening, and Boston greets you with a different face again. The sky overhead is a deepening blue. The first stars faint against the cold air. Lanterns are being lit along the wider streets, their small flames flickering behind horn or glass panes, throwing trembling pools of light on snow and cobbles. The harbour has turned darker, the ship's masts now black lines against the last strip of light on the horizon. From tavern doors comes the glow of fire and candlelight, along with the rumble of men's voices and the clatter of mugs on wooden tables. Your back aches. Your hands are sticky with tar that won't quite come off no matter how you rub them on your coat, and your feet feel as if they have been hammered. You could go straight back to the boarding house, to whatever thin soup Mistress Hardin has managed to stretch from bones and beans, to your straw mattress and the familiar, sour-smelling closeness of other men's sleep. Or you could do what many in your place do, turn your steps toward one of Boston's many taverns, where for the price of a mug of ale, you can claim a little light, a little warmth, and the illusion of time that is yours. Tonight, you choose the tavern. We'll follow you there in the next part, through the low doorway into the smoky warmth where gossip, politics, and jokes wrap themselves around the smell of beer and sweat, and where men who spent the day hauling rope or barrels or ledgers share the small, sharp pleasures that make the hard edges of daily life a little softer. For now, you walk slowly up from the harbour, feeling the day's labour settle into your muscles, the cold bite at your cheeks, and the town around you shift from work to evening in 100 quiet, interconnected ways. By the time you finally peel yourself away from the edge of the wharf and turn your steps back toward the town, it's no longer the sharp, needling cold of morning that stole your breath, but another kind of chill, softer on the surface, yet creeping slowly under your clothes. As evening settles in, and Boston changes its light, its sounds, its smells, without anyone giving a signal. The lamps on the wider streets are already beginning to glow, small yellow flames hidden behind horn or glass, and each one is lit with a little ritual you see repeated again and again. A boy with a long pole raising the flame, touching it to the wick, the light flaring up suddenly, and then settling into a shivering circle on the snow and frozen mud. You climb slowly up from Long Wharf, and the slope feels steeper after a full day on your feet. Your knees protest. The soles of your feet feel as if they've turned to wood. Your back carries the weight of every coil you twisted with your hands, yet your mind starts to loosen itself from the sound of wooden wheels and the rasp of fibers, drawn toward another world entirely. the world of taverns. Taverns in Boston are what phones and social networks are in your world now. Places where information, rumor, gossip, official news, and invented news all get stirred together until you can't quite say where truth ends and story begins. And still everyone comes back to them night after night, as if the city's pulse depends on that mixture. The low door of the Green Dragon, or perhaps of some cheaper neighborhood alehouse, with a name no chronicler ever bothered to write down, opens with a familiar creak, and as you push it, the outside world, sharp and grey and frozen, pulls back like a cold sea, replaced by a wave of air that is suddenly warm and thick with pipe smoke. The sour sweet smell of spilled beer, wet leather, heated wool, and cheap food. The light inside is not the clean, clear light of daytime, but a dirty, trembling glow that comes from a few squat tallow candles and the fire in the hearth. A light that fills corners with heavy shadow, as if it wants to hide and reveal things at the same time. The floor is sticky in places, covered with dirty sawdust or chopped straw, meant to drink in whatever falls and keep people from slipping, and the wooden tabletop where you sit is scored with years of pewter mug blows, knife scratches, and small, secret marks left behind by people who passed through here and will never be names in any book. The beer reaches you in a clay or pewter mug hardly sloshing, and when you lift it you feel the chill of the metal against skin still raw from the cold and the warmth of the liquid rising from inside, and it is its own small, unremarkable miracle. A weak, sour drink that doesn't steal your wits, but loosens your shoulders and gives you the sense that for half an hour your body can pause from asking and simply be. All around you, voice beside voice, builds a kind of thick carpet of sound, laughter that bursts out too loudly, conspiratorial whispers bent close over corner tables, stories retold for the 10th time with the same pleasure as the first, gossip about a ship that limped into port with torn sails, about a merchant who lost everything in a fire, about a girl on the edge of town who has given birth to twins, whose father is now a matter of discussion in at least 3 neighborhoods. Politics here is not a dry word. It is the seasoning that gets sprinkled over any conversation, even over an argument about the quality of the beer. An old sailor with a white scar running over half his face is telling how the ports of Barbados are thick with rum and with enslaved people treated as cargo. And 2 tables away, someone in a slightly better coat is quoting from a newspaper brought from London, talking about a new duty on glass or paper, while a joiner with cracked hands and dust under his nails nods slowly and says that for him, all that matters is whether he can feed his children when winter comes. You drink slowly, feeling that heavy post-work quiet settle over you, that moment when your body is too tired to tense anymore. You're no orator. You have no speeches to deliver. When you open your mouth, the words that come out are simple. You talk about the harsh, unseasonable cold, about a co-worker who cut his hand and now fears infection, about a rumor that someone wants to build a new warehouse right next to your rope walk, which could mean more work or more chaos, depending on whose story you believe. At the tables around you, you can see the layering of the town in a way no history manual ever really captures. At one slightly secluded table, 2 men in modest wigs and finer waistcoats speak in low voices, brows furrowed. Nobody sits too close, but everyone feels that whatever they are planning will ripple outward over many lives. At another table, a cluster of workmen, carpenters, shoemakers, sailors, slam their mugs together in wordless understanding, their rough, unspoken solidarity stronger than any written declaration. In the corner near the fire, you see a black man in a simple but clean shirt, sitting with his back straight, eyes on the flames. When he laughs at a joke someone makes, you see white teeth and eyes shining. And for a brief moment he is not slave or free man, not just a label pinned on by a society that would measure him in coins, but simply another tired man warming himself at the same fire as everyone else. The tavern women move between the tables with an efficiency that reminds you of well-twisted rope. They waste no motion, no breath. One hand sets down a mug, the other collects a few coins. The mouth says, "Another, or are you done for the night?" while the eyes are already keeping track of who is too drunk and needs to be shown the door, who is about to start a fight, who has been a good-paying regular for years. It's a kind of invisible evening government, run by women with strong arms and practical minds who know exactly how much trouble a night can absorb before someone ends up with a cracked skull or a knife between the ribs. At some point, someone starts a song, not a jolly drinking tune, but a long ballad about a ship caught in a storm and a man who never comes home. Voices join in one by one, some off-key, others deep and steady, and the song rolls through the room like a wave, hitting the low ceiling, sliding along the beams, slipping out through the cracks along with the smoke. You don't sing, but you feel the skin on your arms prickle a little, because the verses are never just story. Almost everyone here has lost someone to a storm, to a sudden illness, to an accident at work, and the song clings to those memories like pitch to rope. As evenings pile up one on another, tavern after tavern, day after long day of labor, you realize that for many people in Boston this is the only room where they can afford to live, even a little differently from the grind of hurry, work, endure. Here, they tell dreams and plans, they laugh at their own failures, they exaggerate their small triumphs, they invent nicknames and launch tiny conspiracies, whether they're about politics or simply about a more elaborate practical joke at a neighbor's expense. When your mug is empty and you feel that if you stay any longer, the tiredness will turn into a kind of soft heaviness that will keep you nailed to the bench until late into the night, you get up, your knees ache a little, and when you take those first steps toward the door, you realize how used your body had grown to the thick, smoky warmth inside, because the air outside feels like a thin, sharp blade across your face. The streets sound different now than they did at midday. Fewer vendors' cries, less rattling of wheels, more hush of quick footsteps. A burst of laughter cut short at the foot of a stair, a door slammed shut, a dog barking behind a fence, a drunk man singing a psalm badly on his way home. The lamps create narrow corridors of light between blocks of darkness, and everyone's shadows stretch out long and thin across the snow, as if for a moment they are all larger than they really are. When you reach the lodging house door, there's no welcoming golden rectangle spilling onto the snow, just a small flame flickering in a hallway lamp. The door creaks, the stairs complain under your weight, and the familiar smell of hay, smoke, sheets long overdue for washing, and cabbage soup that seems to have soaked into the beams, tells you that you are home, at least as much as a room shared with two other men in an expensive, crowded town can be called home. In the sleeping room, Amos is already snoring, in a rhythm so regular it's almost comical, one arm sticking out from under the blanket, while Thomas is still awake, back propped against the wall, trying to read by the trembling light of a candle that is shrinking before your eyes. His book might be a New Testament, a battered arithmetic manual, a collection of sermons. The title hardly matters, only that he is forcing his tired eyes to follow the lines, because in this town ordinary people know that letters are a kind of power, even if they don't have a name for it. You undo your laces slowly, pulling your boots off with a small sigh of relief as your heels come free, then loosen the frozen stiff buttons of your coat. There is no long bedtime ritual of washing and creams. You rub your eyes with your palms and perhaps, if there's still a little water in the basin, splash your face twice to lift the worst of the dust and grime, then let yourself drop onto the straw mattress, feeling your body yield to gravity like an old rope finally allowed to slacken. It is not truly silent. The house itself breathes. The creak of timbers, a muffled murmur from the room below, a few whispered words between two lovers who think no one can hear them, the wind worrying at the eaves with a thin whistling note. Outside, someone hurries past along the street, their steps hollow on the frozen crust of snow. Farther away, a church bell strikes the hour, leaving, between each stroke, a pocket of stillness in which you can hear the rhythm of your own heart. As your eyelids grow heavier, your thoughts stray, almost against your will, to things larger than your day's work. You wonder, not very clearly, how the town would look from above, through the eyes of an eagle or of God. All these little rooms, all these people lying down, all their worries, all their prayers, all their grudges and tiny joys, spread out over a strip of land surrounded by dark, cold water. You remember Sunday, the hard benches in church, the long sermon about obedience and order and the will of the Lord, and you remember how, at the tavern, people spoke in the same breath about injustice and taxes and resistance. Your Boston is not yet the cradle of revolution. For you, it is a string of hard days tied one to the next, with work and cold and an occasional mug of beer, an occasional joke, an occasional small luxury like a slightly fattier piece of meat, or a candle lit just to read by, but without your knowing it, everything you live, the price of bread, the way a soldier looks at you, the whispered joke about the king, the song sung a little too loudly about liberty, is slowly pushing the world towards something new. Until then, though, down at the level of your straw mattress, all that really matters is that your back doesn't hurt quite as sharply as it did an hour ago, that the thin blanket keeps at least some of the cold at bay, that Amos's snoring fades into a kind of background noise like waves against the wharf, and that tomorrow, with another shift at the rope walk, another plain midday meal, another evening of choices between hunger and beer and sleep, will come whether you are ready for it or not. Morning doesn't so much arrive as seep in. It comes first as a faint greying at the edges of the window, a change in the sound of the street outside, less of the rolling rumble of wagon wheels, more of the softer scattered tap of early footsteps, and then as the thin, stubborn light that pushes its way past warped glass and imperfect shutters until it finally lands on your eyelids and refuses to leave you in peace. On a working day you'd already be fumbling for your stockings by now, half awake thinking about hemp and tar before your feet even touch the floor. But today is different. Today is Sunday. And in 18th century Boston, Sunday is not optional. The city itself feels different on a Sunday morning. Even from your straw mattress before you sit up, you can sense the hush. The usual clatter and shouting that begin at dawn on weekdays are muted. No dockhands bawling at each other over crates, no carts rattling at full speed toward the harbour, no hawkers testing their voices on the air. Work, at least the obvious kind, has stepped back, or has learned to move quietly in the shadows, because the Sabbath is supposed to belong to God and to the ministers who speak in his name. Mistress Hutchins has been awake for hours by the time you swing your legs off the bed. She has a whole boarding house to shepherd into respectability, and that takes time. The smell of porridge oats stretched with water and a little milk, sweetened with a spoonful of molasses, if you are fortunate, drifts up the staircase, and below you can hear bowls clinking, spoons knocking against wood, the low, sleepy grumble of men who know there is no point in arguing with either Sabbath or landlady. You dress more carefully than you would for the rope walk, not because you have finer clothes, but because whatever you own must look its best today. You shake out your one decent shirt, smoothing the worst of the creases with your palm. You brush off the dust and dried tar from your coat as best you can, scrape your boots against the edge of the hearth to dislodge last week's mud. The cloth is still thin at the elbows, the leather still cracked, but seen from a pew at a distance, in a room where everyone is also making do, you will pass. Breakfast is quick and quiet. The porridge is hot enough to burn your tongue and thin enough to remind you that oats are expensive this year. Men eat with their shoulders hunched, not talking much, minds already moving toward the next part of the day. Someone mumbles a line about hoping the sermon won't run as long as last week's. Someone else says that with the weather turning, the minister will probably take the chance to warn everyone about death and judgment again. Winter is always a good backdrop for that. There are a few half-suppressed smiles, but nobody speaks loudly enough for Mistress Hutchins to hear. She has no patience for irreverence under her roof. When you step out into the street, the cold feels cleaner than it did last night, as if the city has been wiped down somehow. People are already moving in small family clusters, heading toward their meeting houses, each ward of Boston flowing gently toward its own particular spiritual center. Women walk with shawls wrapped close, skirts held slightly up from the slush. Men have faces newly shaved, or at least newly rinsed and combed, hair tied back with ribbon that might be faded, but is still carefully knotted. Children in miniature versions of their parents' clothes hop and skip until a stern look or a quiet word pulls them back into the solemn procession. You fall in step with others from your neighborhood, and together you walk the familiar route through narrow streets that smell this morning less of fish and smoke and more of damp wool and the faint beeswax of candles carried inside cloak folds. Doors close behind you as people leave their homes. Shutters are pulled over shop windows. Signs that earlier in the week creak proudly in the wind are now still and blank. Their promises of sugar, cloth, tools, and books, temporarily replaced by the unspoken promise that today, at least in public, no trade will be done. The meeting house itself is not grand, not in the way churches will be in later centuries. It is a large wooden box of a building, plain on the outside, built more for function than display. The tower, if there is one, is modest, a place for a bell and perhaps a simple weather vane creaking in the weak wind. Inside, though, it holds the whole social skeleton of your world. You step into a space filled with pale winter light, and the smell of bodies in close quarters, wool, soap, smoke. A hint of stale sweat, carefully ignored. The pews are hard and straight-backed, and they are not just places to sit. They are statements. At the front, nearer the pulpit, sit the families who have been in Boston the longest, who own the most land, whose names open doors. Their benches are sometimes boxed in, with little wooden partitions to keep out drafts, and symbolically to mark a boundary between them and everyone else. Further back, the pews become plainer, the coats rougher, the hands more calloused. Up in the gallery, above and behind, stand the less favored apprentices, servants, sometimes enslaved people, everyone whose place in this carefully arranged universe is still being decided, or is decided in a way that leaves little room to move. You find your own accustomed spot, with men you know from the rope walk and the wharf, shoulders touching, knees almost pressed against the bench in front. Hats are removed, heads bowed, and the hum of quiet conversation dies away until all that remains is the shuffle of feet and the rustle of skirts as people settle. The minister climbs to the high pulpit, a wooden platform reached by a steep, narrow stair, carrying his Bible and perhaps a few folded pages of notes. From up there he can see everything. Every bowed head, every half-closed eye, every child fidgeting, every adult whose mind has wandered to unpaid debts or a sick cow or a rumor about more troops on the way. His voice, when he begins to speak, is not gentle. It is trained to carry to the farthest corner, cutting through the layered air with sharp, distinct words that leave no doubt about sin, salvation, duty, and the proper order of things. The sermon is long, easily an hour, often more. He speaks of Scripture, yes, of Christ and covenant and the trials of Israel in the wilderness, but he also speaks of Boston. He talks of the dangers of idleness and taverns, of the temptation of gossip and vanity, of the pride of men who set themselves against appointed authority. He weaves the events of the week, a merchant caught cheating his customers, a fight outside a tavern, a whispered comment about Parliament and rights, into his warnings, not necessarily naming names, but sending the strong message that God sees all, and that he and the local elders talk more often than some might like. You sit and listen as best you can. Sometimes the words catch you, a phrase about the brevity of life landing with real weight in a chest that has seen too many coffins pass along the street. Other times your mind drifts in long, lazy loops. You trace the grain of the wood on the pew in front of you. You count the knots in the beams above. You watch a ray of sunlight slowly move across the floor as the morning advances. Your back begins to ache from the unyielding boards, your legs go numb, your stomach, still running on thin porridge, grumbles quietly. In a pew not too far from the front, a woman dabs her eyes with a corner of her kerchief as the minister speaks of children called back to God before their time. She has lost 3, maybe 4. Many here have. In the gallery, a black man stands very still, his expression unreadable as the preacher talks about bondage to sin. The minister means spiritual chains, but the metaphor lands differently in some hearts than in others. In the back row, an apprentice fights sleep with all the determination of a man twice his age, his head nodding forward and jerking back in small, embarrassing movements until his master clears his throat pointedly at his side. There is singing too, though less ornate than what later centuries will consider proper hymns. The psalm tunes are old and simple. A deacon lines out each verse, chanting the words so the congregation can repeat them, since not everyone can read from a book. The voices are rough and mismatched, some high and thin, some low and booming. But when they blend together, however imperfectly, the sound fills the room with something both homely and strangely grand, as if for a moment everyone here is more than tired farmers and tradesmen and housewives and servants. They are part of some larger story that stretches back across oceans and centuries. When the service finally ends and the minister speaks the last blessing, there is a subtle loosening across the room, like a rope that has been taut for hours finally given a little slack. People rise, skirts swish, boots thump on the floor, children shift their weight from one numb leg to the other. There is no rush for the door, not in this world where even haste must mind its manners, but the air vibrates with a quiet relief all the same. Outside, the winter light has grown stronger but not warmer. Clusters form on the steps and in the yard, women exchanging news in low voices about a neighbour's illness, a birth, a possible match between two young people, men speaking in cautious tones about the latest pamphlet from London, the rumour of new taxes, a speech someone heard in another meeting house that mentioned liberty a little too boldly. Somewhere, a boy kicks at a drift of dirty snow and earns a swift warning look from his mother. For some, the rest of the Sabbath will be spent in pious calm, a second service in the afternoon, Bible reading at home, careful talk at the table about the sermon's message. For others, especially those whose work never entirely stops, innkeepers who must feed travellers, sailors still on watch aboard ships, women with crying babies and endless chores, the day will blur into the others, marked more by what they are supposed not to do than by any real rest. You walk back toward the boarding house along streets that feel suspended, as if someone has pressed pause on the noisier parts of the town. A few taverns are technically closed, their shutters drawn, but everyone knows there are back doors and side rooms where a mug can still be had for those bold enough to seek it. A constable passes by looking important, keeping an eye out for obvious games or drunkenness. The law is firmer on Sundays, or at least more visible. At dinner the food is slightly better than on other days. Mistress Hutchins makes a point of that. Perhaps there is a small piece of beef boiled with turnips, or a thicker slice of bread than usual, or a bit of apple preserved from last autumn's harvest. It is still simple fare, but there is a sense that even if the soul has been fed with stern words all morning, the body is owed a little extra by way of compensation. The afternoon stretches long. In summer you might spend it outside, walking along the edge of the common, watching children roll hoops or fly crude kites, feeling the rough grass under your boots. In winter the temptation is strong to creep back under your blanket and sleep, letting the chill air wrap around your nose while the rest of you sinks into straw and dreams. But sometimes James will appear and nudge you. Sometimes there are quiet meetings, not as loud and crowded as those at the Green Dragon, but no less important, where men gather in someone's back room to talk about town matters that do not yet have permission to be discussed in public. Because underneath the orderly rhythm of Sundays, of sermons and psalms and carefully controlled rest, another rhythm is beating, slow and steady, like a drum too soft for most ears but impossible to ignore once you have heard it. Boston's daily life is steeped in habit and tradition. The rope walk, the market, the chapel, the tavern, the sickbed, the graveyard. Yet beneath those repeating patterns, the ground is shifting in ways that a tired apprentice cannot quite name but feels all the same, in the way conversations lower when a redcoat passes by, in the way even ministers have begun to choose their examples more carefully. Tomorrow will be Monday again, and the smell of hemp and tar will meet you at dawn, and your hands will find their place on the spinning fibres exactly as they always have. But the Sabbaths, with their forced stillness, their long stretches of thought and sermon and song, are slowly teaching the town to ask questions. It never used to ask, to measure the gap between the words spoken from the pulpit and the realities seen in the street. For now, though, the day fades in the familiar way. Candle stubs grow short. The temperature drops a little further as evening slides in. Somewhere in the distance on the harbour, a bell rings from a ship at anchor, marking the changing of the watch, and its sound carries all the way up the hill, a reminder that while Boston pauses, the wider world does not. You lie down again on your narrow bed as darkness thickens, your ears still holding the echo of the morning's psalms and the afternoon's low, serious talk, your body grateful for even this modest respite from labour. Sleep comes with the same slow insistence as always, and as you drift you are not thinking of kings or parliaments or sermons, but of smaller things, whether the snow will hold tomorrow, whether the rope-walk roof will leak in the next storm, whether the woman you glimpsed in her Sunday best on the meeting-house steps will look your way again. History is building itself in the streets outside, brick by brick and word by word, but inside your room, on your straw mattress, you are just a young man in a cold town, folding one more day into the long, uneven stack of days that make up a life. If you stayed only with Sundays and rope-walk days, you might think Boston's life runs on two rails, work and worship, labour and sermon. But the truth is that most of the time you are simply moving through a tangle of smaller patterns that sit between those two poles, days shaped just as much by hunger and chores and bad teeth, as by laws and proclamations and distant kings. Take the mornings when you are not quite well. For example, those days when you wake and your body feels a shade heavier than it should, your skin too hot under the blanket, your mouth dry with a sour taste, and the simple act of sitting up makes the room tilt slightly. Illness in this city is not a rare interruption. It is a regular visitor slipping through doors and shutters as easily as the wind. A cough that starts in one house has a way of echoing in others within a week. Fevers jump from bed to bed, stomach troubles ripple through whole streets. If a well goes bad or meat was kept too long in the wrong weather, when you cannot drag yourself to the rope walk, when your legs fold under you on the first try, you stay in bed, not because it is comfortable, straw lumps and all, but because there is nothing else you can do. Mistress Hutchins is not heartless. She has buried people. She knows the look of a face that is pretending, and a face that genuinely cannot stand. She will bring you a tin cup of water and a little broth if she has it to spare, will mutter about lost wages and about how she cannot afford to have sickness spreading in her house. But she will also tuck the blanket a bit closer around your shoulders before she leaves, as if by accident. Doctors exist, of course, men with training and Latin words, but they are expensive and the line between help and harm is thin. More often it is women who tend the sick, older widows who have watched a lifetime of fevers burn through families, midwives who know the colour of bad infections, black women, free and enslaved, who carry in their heads a quiet collection of remedies drawn from Africa, from native herbs, from the desperate need to make something work because there is no alternative. They brew bitter teas from willow bark or yarrow, they lay on mustard plasters, they bleed and purge when they think they must. They sit through the night in rooms that smell of sweat and vinegar and chamber pots, listening to breathing that rattles and wondering if it will still be there at dawn. Sometimes the body recovers, slowly, like a rope that seemed ready to snap but turns out to hold. You spend 3-4 days sliding between fits of sleep and restless waking, drifting in and out as the sounds of the boarding house wash over you in muffled waves. The thump of boots in the hall, a pot clanging below, someone laughing too loudly, someone crying quietly in the next room. Then one morning you realize your head feels clearer, your tongue less dry. The simple act of sitting up no longer sends the walls moving in and out. You stand unsteady but standing, and within a day or two you are back at the rope walk, your place filled for the moment by someone else but quietly yours again. Other times people do not recover. A cough turns thick and wet, a fever climbs and does not come down, and suddenly there is another funeral procession moving along the street. Another set of black coats, another set of muffled footsteps in the snow or dust, another name spoken with a little pause after it, as if the speaker is still not entirely convinced that the person is gone. In those moments, daily life tightens around grief, and then, inexorably, relaxes again. Because work does not stop for one person's loss. The rope must still be made, the fish still caught, the bread still baked. There are other authorities in Boston besides the ministers and the masters who own shops and rope walks. The law has its corners in daily life, just as present in its way as tar and salt. Near the meeting house stands the whipping post and the stocks, and you pass them often enough that they almost fade into the scenery. A wooden frame, an iron ring, a couple of worn boards with holes cut for ankles, but every now and then they step out of the background and remind you what they are for. On a weekday morning, as you walk to the wharf, you might see a man already in the stocks, his legs trapped, his back against the cold wood. He could have been there since dawn for public drunkenness, or for skipping out on debts, or for speaking too freely about the wrong person. His cheeks are flushed, not from drink now, but from humiliation and the wind. Children walk past and stare openly until their mothers drag them along. A few boys, bolder or meaner, might throw something. Nothing hard, just a clod of dirt, a bit of rotten fruit, then scatter when a constable looks their way. Punishment is meant to be seen. That is the point. A whipping is not carried out behind closed doors, but in the open, lashes counted in public, each one both pain and message. You do not linger when you hear that the lash is coming. You do not have the stomach for it, and besides, the rope walk will not wait because the law wishes to make an example. But you hear the stories later, how many strokes, whether the man screamed or clenched his teeth in silence, whether the blood flowed, whether anyone begged for mercy. These details become part of the city's talk, warnings woven into gossip the way hemp is twisted into rope. Markets are another heart of everyday life. Very different in sound and smell from both taverns and meeting houses. Faneuil Hall and the streets around it are crowded most days with stalls and barrows, a jumble of goods that never seems quite enough, and yet somehow keeps the town alive. You walk there often, sometimes on errands for the rope walk, sometimes simply because you need to buy food, and every time you are struck anew by the noise. Vendors call out in overlapping waves, fishwives advertising fresh cod and mackerel with voices that slice through the air. Farmers from nearby towns offering cabbages, squashes, onions, their faces red from the wind and hours of travel. Women selling eggs from baskets lined with straw, butchers with cuts of beef and pork hanging from hooks, blood dripping slowly onto sawdust. The smell is an assault. Salt fish, raw meat, crushed herbs, smoke from small braziers, human bodies too close together, the faint sourness of garbage piled where it shouldn't be. Money changes hands constantly here, in small clenched amounts, a few coppers for a loaf of bread, haggling over the price of a chicken that has already been carried too far to be brought back to the farm, a long negotiation over cloth from Europe that will eventually become a Sunday dress if the buyer can ever afford to pay the rest. Sometimes barter takes the place of coins. A day's labor promised in exchange for credit, a repaired barrel set against a bill for flour. Everyone is always aware of debt, of who owes whom, of who is one bad harvest or one illness away from losing their plot of land or their place in town. Behind many of the market stalls are women who make the numbers work in ways that never appear in ledgers. A wife who quietly waters the beer to stretch the barrel across 2 more nights. A widow who takes in lodgers and mending and washing, each small coin added carefully to a cup hidden in a cupboard. A girl who saves the few pennies she earns cleaning someone else's house so that one day perhaps she might leave service and marry a man with a trade instead of staying forever in other people's kitchens. When the weather softens, when winter finally steps back and the mud of spring gives way to something resembling firm earth, daily life expands outward. Doors and windows are open to let out months of smoke and sweat. Rugs and blankets are beaten with sticks in yards and alleys, sending dust clouds into the pale sunlight. Children shake off the disciplined stillness expected on long, cold evenings and spill into the lanes, playing games with stones and sticks, chasing hoops, skipping rope. Sunday afternoons on Boston Common, when the grass is green and the sky kindly, show another side of the town. Families walk slowly along the paths, men with their coats off, women with their hats pinned neatly, babies drowsing in arms. Young people exchange glances when their elders look away. Hands brush in ways that could be accident, could be invitation. Boys fly kites that tug at string like impatient birds, their tails fluttering in the breeze, while younger siblings run behind, shrieking with excitement when the kite climbs and groaning theatrically when it dives. You might sit on a low rock or fallen tree and watch all of this, feeling the rare luxury of time that is not filled with work. The common is also where you see, with your own eyes, the unevenness of the town. Well-dressed families stroll past with an air of ownership, shoes polished, linen bright, their children's faces clean and round. Further off, near the edges, labourers rest in shirt sleeves, boots off, toes wiggling in the grass, their conversation laced with jokes and curses and complaints about wages. Enslaved men and women pass through in livery that marks them as belonging to someone else's household, never quite standing still unless their masters do, never quite at ease. Summer brings its own hazards. The heat lies heavy over the harbour, turning the smell of the water rank. Food spoils faster, flies gather on anything left uncovered. Disease, especially in cramped, poorer quarters, finds new fuel. Nights are shorter, sleep lighter, thanks to the stuffy air in low-ceilinged rooms. You might lie awake with the blanket thrown aside, listening to Amos snore, and to someone coughing in the alley below, sweat trickling down your chest despite the darkness. Yet summer also means longer days, more work, more ships, a sense that the town is humming at full pitch. Carpenters and shipwrights labour late to get vessels ready before autumn storms. Farmers bring in carts piled high with produce, selling vegetables that taste like more than survival for a change. On some evenings, when the breeze off the water is finally cool, someone might set up a fiddle in a courtyard, and there will be a rough, impromptu dance. Nothing fancy, just men and women and children turning in circles, feet stamping, laughter spilling upward to the stars. You notice as the years go by how these small patterns begin to twist around the larger ones of politics and tension. A market argument about the price of tea becomes, almost without anyone deciding it should, a debate about taxes. A conversation in a tavern about a merchant cheating his customers slides naturally into talk of governors and customs officials, and whether the law truly protects common people. A funeral sermon meant to comfort those who have lost someone to fever or accident takes on a different weight when the minister mentions tyranny or injustice in even the vaguest terms. And through all of it, through stomachaches and first kisses and sprained ankles and new pairs of shoes hardening blisters into callus, through songs learned and forgotten and learned again, your own days keep looping back to the rope walk. Even when your mind is elsewhere, on the memory of a woman's laugh in the tavern, on a phrase you read in a pamphlet, on the question of whether you might one day open your own small shop, your hands are there, turning fibres into something strong enough to hold under strain. It is a strangely fitting trade for this moment in time. Boston itself is a rope under tension, strands of daily life and deep belief and simmering anger twisted together, pulled tighter and tighter by unseen hands on two continents. From your place on Long Wharf, with tar on your palms and salt in your nose, you can feel that pull, even if you cannot yet see where or when the strain will finally be too much. One morning, as you walk to work with the sun just beginning to colour the tops of the masts, you pass a small group of boys sitting on a step, each with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil or charcoal. They are copying something from a larger sheet that one of them holds carefully, the way you might hold a delicate tool. As you draw closer, you see that it is a broadside, a printed sheet with a crude engraving at the top and words marching in tight black lines below. The image is familiar now, a line of soldiers, smoke, bodies on the ground. The boys' tongues stick out in concentration as they try to mimic the letters, tracing the shapes slowly so they can learn to write them later on their own. One of them looks up at you, eyes bright, and says a word you have been hearing more often lately, spoken with different accents and intentions, in taverns and kitchens and back rooms and alleys. Liberty, he says, stumbling slightly over the consonants, but proud to have gotten it out at all. See, I can spell it. You nod, perhaps ruffle his hair, and keep walking, because Mr. Grey expects you on time and rope never makes itself. But the word sticks with you, a new fibre in the bundle of thoughts that spool out behind your eyes as your hands do their practiced work. The days, taken one by one, are still mostly the same. Wake, eat, work, eat again if you are lucky. Talk, sleep. The details shift with the seasons, with illness or health, with small joys and small sorrows. Yet somewhere behind all of that, like the deep hum beneath the creak and clatter of a busy wharf, something larger is building, and your ordinary days in 1770s Boston, muddy and hungry and half-frozen and filled with the smell of tar and the sound of church bells, are the planks and nails and coils of rope from which that larger thing will be built. You do not know that yet. You only know that your hands are sore, the air smells of hemp and salt and wood smoke, and the bell at the far end of the rope walk is about to ring again, calling you back from your thoughts to the next long stretch of twisting and walking and enduring that, in its quiet way, is history in the making. The bell at the end of the rope walk rings, a dull, familiar sound that bounces along the long wooden tunnel and over your tired nerves like a stone skipping along water. You straighten, flex your fingers once, twice, feeling the stiffness in the joints, the thin ridges of cracked skin along your knuckles. For a few heartbeats, the building is filled with nothing but the creak of boards as men shift their weight, roll their shoulders, lean away from the endless line of hemp that has eaten the daylight. Some of the men go straight from here to the taverns. Some head to the market to snatch what food is left before vendors pack up. Some will walk all the way to the edge of town to feed a pig or a cow kept in a tiny yard. You turn toward the narrower, more tangled streets of the North End, toward the places where people sleep stacked in wooden boxes one atop another, an entire city packed into a small peninsula that feels sometimes more like a ship than a town, noisy, crowded, full of lives, pressed close together with nowhere else to go. The houses in your part of Boston are not handsome mansions with symmetrical windows and painted doors. They are crooked, timber-framed creatures that seem to lean on each other for support. 3 stories, sometimes 4, each floor a little larger than the one below because the upper rooms jut out into the street to steal a few more inches of private space from the public air. The walls are clapboard, weathered grey, or painted in colours that were bright once. Chimneys squat heavy along the roofs like sentries, and here and there laundry flaps from lines strung between windows, turning the narrow lane into a tunnel of shirts and petticoats. Inside these houses is where most of Boston's life actually happens, the part that seldom gets remembered when people talk about battles and speeches. There are no hallways in the way you might imagine them. Rooms lead into rooms, spaces divided more by what people do in them than by any strict architect's plan. In a poorer home, the main room serves as kitchen, living space, workroom, sometimes bedroom. The hearth dominates one wall, the great open fire not just for warmth but for every form of cooking. Iron hooks hang from a crane, swinging heavy pots of stew or porridge into and out of the flames. A kettle is almost always on, water never allowed to cool, ready to scald, to wash, to turn into thin tea. The smell of smoke never entirely leaves. It lives in the rafters, in the thread of clothes, in the hair of the children who play so close they can feel the heat on their faces. A long table sits near the hearth, its surface scarred by knives, ink, candle wax. It is the place where bread is kneaded, where fish are gutted, where accounts are reckoned, where children trace letters with clumsy fingers in a smear of spilled flour when no one is looking. Benches push underneath during the day and are dragged out at meals. At night they might be moved aside to make room for pallets on the floor, straw mattresses rolled out from corners like patches of soft earth on a wooden deck. The women of these houses carry the daily rhythm like a rope around their shoulders, a constant pulling that begins before the sun is up and ends long after it goes down. They are up first, coaxing last night's embers into flame, measuring out the grain that must somehow feed everyone until market day, sending older children to fetch water from the nearest well with wooden buckets that leave rings on their fingers. They scrub, sew, mend, stir, lift, soothe. If their husband is away at sea, they do all of this, and mind the accounts and haggle at the market, and decide whether to take in a lodger to cover the rent. Laundry day is a thing in itself, an entire small universe of labour. In warm weather you can see it announced in lanes and yards, shirts, shifts, stockings, bed linens, all boiled in great pots outdoors, stirred with paddles or sticks, the steam rising in clouds that smell of lye and sweat. Women bend over tubs, arms red to the elbow, beating cloth against washboards or against stones if there is nothing else. Children carry smaller bundles, little bodies wobbly under the weight, learning early what it means to keep clean in a town where dirt seems to seep back in through every gap the moment you wipe it away. Fire is the constant background fear behind all this bustling domesticity. A single overturned candle, a chimney left unswept, a cinder that jumps from a hearth onto a wooden floor. Any of these can turn a cramped, timber-packed street into a fuse. You have seen it before, the sudden clang of alarm bells, not the slow, measured toll of worship or mourning, but a frantic hammering that sends people pouring out of doors with buckets and hooks and long poles, faces white in the reflection of flames. Boston has fire engines, hand-pumped machines on wheels, heavy, painted, pulled by lines of men, but they are small against a roaring building. When a blaze catches hold, whole neighborhoods work together, forming bucket lines from wells and cisterns, dousing not just the house already burning, but its neighbors, soaking shingles and clapboards in an attempt to halt the fire's hunger. Children carry smaller buckets, their eyes wide, hair and faces smeared with soot. Men shout themselves hoarse. Women run back inside to snatch up a cradle, a chest of linen, a Bible, a box of account books, whatever seems most irreplaceable in that moment. You remember one night in particular, a winter fire when the wind was high, snow turned grey and then black where sparks landed on it. Ice around the well cracked from the speed with which bucket after bucket was thrust in and hauled up. In the morning, when the fire had finally choked itself out on its own destruction, what was left of the house was a blackened shell, chimneys standing like gravestones in the midst of ash. The family that had lived there sat on a borrowed bench, wrapped in borrowed blankets, staring at the place where their table used to be, their beds, their whole known world. Within a few days, neighbors had found them a place to stay, had gathered clothes and pots and a little food, had begun, in small, stubborn ways, to rebuild what the flames had taken. That is how most survival happens here, not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in little shared pieces of kindness laid end to end. Not every home in Boston is like your lodging house or that burned-out shell. In the better parts of town, on King Street, along Beacon Hill, near the houses of the big merchants close to the harbour, you sometimes catch glimpses of other worlds when doors open or shutters are drawn aside. There are parlours warmed by tiled stoves, their floors covered with woven mats or imported carpets, chairs with cushions instead of bare boards, curtains of printed cotton instead of simple linen. On polished tables stand china cups thin as eggshell, silver spoons that shine like captured light, porcelain figurines from distant places that you know only as names, shouted on the wharf. In those houses, women have more things to dust, more delicate fabrics to guard against smoke, more servants to direct. They do not work less, exactly. Their work is different, hidden behind decorum and gentler fabrics, managing households, arranging marriages, writing out lists of goods and correspondence in neat script. In the back rooms and kitchens of those same houses, other women, poor white women, free black women, enslaved women, do work very much like that in your own world, stirring pots, kneading dough, scrubbing floors with harsh sand until the boards are pale and raw. The line between mistress and maid runs straight through the same building, dividing who sleeps where, who eats what, who must rise at the first cry of a baby that is not their own. Courtship threads itself through these cramped domestic spaces and crowded streets in small, careful ways. There are no dances every weekend for people like you, no grand balls with chandeliers and hired musicians, but there are barn dances in outlying villages, husking bees and quilting gatherings where hands work while tongues talk, and the talk is as important as the work. There are Sunday afternoons when young men linger just a little longer near the meeting house steps, pretending to argue about doctrine while keeping one eye on a particular bonnet. You yourself have known the quick, awkward heat of standing too close to someone at a market stall, both of you reaching for the same basket of apples, have felt your chest tighten when a girl in a blue shawl smiled and said your name, and then turned away because her father was watching. Courtship here is not a matter of bouquets and poetry. It is whispered conversations snatched in doorways, letters written clumsily by candlelight and hidden under floorboards, promises made with no guarantee that life will not snap them in half within a year. Children move constantly through all of this, a living, noisy current that flows around adults and their serious concerns. They are set to work early, hauling water, minding younger siblings, carding wool, picking oakum, yet they still find time to play in the cracks of the day. They hop across frozen puddles in winter, trying not to break the ice. They chase each other among hanging linens on wash day, turning the alleys into a white maze. They climb on crates and barrels stacked near the wharves, earning scoldings and the occasional cuff around the ear from anxious parents. Some of them will live long enough to tell their own children about these streets. Many will not. The numbers are cruel and simple. You do not stop to think of them often. It would be like stopping to count grains of sand on the shore before you go to sea. But the knowledge is there. Quiet and hard babies born and buried within the same year, toddlers carried to small graves, older children laid beneath headstones carved with skulls and wings and verses about the frailty of life. Grief is not less sharp because it is common. It is simply more practiced. In the quieter hours late at night when your work is done and you have enough candle stub left to burn an extra inch, you sometimes read, or, if your letters are still halting, you trace the shapes in a borrowed book, mouthing the words under your breath. The Bible is always present. Its stories and phrases are so woven into your days that you sometimes hear verses in the rhythm of a rope turning, see parables in the way men speak and fail and forgive. But there are other texts drifting into Boston now, pamphlets from London and Philadelphia and New York, broadsides not just about taxes but about ideas, about natural rights and consent of the governed, about ancient republics and citizens instead of subjects. You do not swallow all of it at once. Some of it seems grand and distant, spun from the same kind of ink as sermons, meant for people who will never soil their hands with tar. Yet certain phrases snag in your mind and do not let go, much like that boy's careful liberty on the step. You catch yourself repeating them as you walk the length of the rope walk, as you turn fibers under your palms. No taxation without representation. The rights of Englishmen. The good of the people is the highest law. They do not make bread cheaper or winters warmer, but they change the way you look at things you have always taken for granted. Sometimes, on still evenings when the harbour is mostly quiet and the cries of gulls have softened, you walk down to the very edge of the water and stand looking out at the black shapes of ships against the darker sea. Lanterns sway on their masts like small floating stars. Each vessel is a path to somewhere else, to the Sugar Islands, to England, to Africa, to other colonies along the coast. Men your age and younger are asleep in hammocks in those hulls, or standing watch on decks feeling a different set of winds on their faces. You wonder what it would be like to go, to leave behind the cramped lanes and predictable days, to trade the steady ache in your shoulders for the constant movement of the sea. But you also know what you have heard in taverns and from sailors at the rope walk, stories of fever-ridden ports, of captains who never quite pay what they promised, of ships that never arrive where they were meant to. Boston might be crowded and tense and cold, but you know its streets in your bones now. Its dangers are familiar. Its comforts, however small, belong to you. Behind you, the town murmurs in its sleep. Somewhere a woman turns over in bed and reaches out for a husband who is not there. Somewhere a child wakes from a nightmare and cries until a tired hand strokes their hair. Somewhere a constable pauses under a lantern and stifles a yawn, his thoughts drifting to the warmth of his own bed. Somewhere in a house finer than most, a man sits at a desk scratching with his quill, turning his day's observations into lines of argument that will make their way into the papers, into meetings, into history. You stand for one more moment, feeling the damp of the wharf boards under your boots, the salt-sour smell of the tide rising and falling, and then you turn back toward the narrow streets and shaky stairs that lead to your bed. Tomorrow there will be more rope to twist, more news to hear, more small tasks to fill the hours. The big changes, if they are coming, will not arrive all at once, like a storm front, but one small day at a time, stitched into breakfasts and errands and arguments and songs. For now you climb the last few creaking steps to your room, body heavy, mind full of threads you cannot quite tie together, and you lie down on your straw mattress in a town that is, without really knowing it, inching its way towards something that will one day be called a revolution, built entirely out of days that look, from the inside, very much like this one. There is a part of the city that you rarely see up close, yet it moves around you all the time like a shadow, and once you begin to notice it, you cannot stop seeing it, because it touches almost every street, every household, every bit of wealth that seems to sit so calmly in polished parlors and brick front houses. Boston is not a slave society in the way the Sugar Islands are, with great plantations rolling away to the horizon, and hundreds of people forced to cut cane under a burning sun. But slavery lives here all the same, woven into the fabric of daily life in smaller, quieter strands that are easy to overlook if you are not the one wearing them. You see enslaved people mostly in motion, because motion is their work. A man in a plain livery coat carries buckets of water from a backyard pump to his master's kitchen, shoulders bent, feet careful on the icy steps. A woman in a neat apron and cap hurries along King Street with a basket on one arm and a child on the other, the child dressed better than she is, the child calling her by a first name while strangers refer to her as the Negro woman who belongs to such and such a household. A boy runs errands between counting houses, holding bills of sale and letters that pass through his hands without ever being meant for his eyes. If you look more closely, you notice the small signs of separate worlds existing inside the same walls. At the back of a merchant's house, a door opens not onto a polished hall, but onto a narrow stair leading to a cramped attic or cellar room with a straw mattress and a peg for clothes. The place where the enslaved man who tends the horses sleeps. The kitchen yard is its own kingdom, ruled by the cook, who may be free or enslaved or something more complicated in between, and whose domain stretches from the garden where herbs grow in dirt, much poorer than the flower beds out front, all the way to the scullery where greasy pots pile up like overlapping moons. At night, when the family gathers in the parlour, candles bright, silver polished, cider warming in a handsome china bowl, there is another circle of people in the back, in dimmer light, talking in voices shaped by different languages and different homelands, sharing stories that will never make it into pamphlets or histories, stories of ships whose holds stank of fear, of markets in faraway ports, of bargains made and broken, of names lost and names remade. Sleep comes later for them, and more likely, a cry from the master's baby can call them up at any hour, as can a bell or a shout or simply the weight of expectation that they must always be ready. Free black Bostonians move through this landscape with a different kind of carefulness. Some are sailors, spending most of their time at sea, coming back with pockets temporarily lined and stories temporarily theirs before the money, and the tails are both spent. Some are artisans, barbers or coopers or cartmen, making their way in a town that will take their labour and their taxes, but will not quite accept their presence as natural. They sit in pews assigned to them at the back or in the gallery. They pay for plots in burial grounds where headstones may or may not bear their names, and they listen to ministers talk about the slavery of sin while knowing that some of the men nodding along in the pews below them own human beings as property. You start to realize that almost everyone in Boston lives with some kind of line drawn around them, some boundary they did not ask for, but which shapes their days all the same. Servant and master, apprentice and journeyman, woman and man, white and black, free and enslaved. Sometimes the lines are hard and bright, like the edge of a knife. Sometimes they are softer, blurred by affection or habit, by secret kindness or secret resentment. But they are always there, and daily life is partly the art of learning where they lie and how far they can be bent before they snap. Education is another thread that runs quietly through these days. For many, letters are a luxury, picked up slowly from a Bible at home, or from a neighbor willing to show them how to scratch their name. But Boston has schools now. Small wooden buildings where boys and, in some cases, girls sit on narrow benches and learn to turn ink and paper into meaning. You pass such a school one afternoon, drawn by the thin chorus of recited lessons pouring out through the half-open shutters. Inside, a dozen boys in rough coats stand beside their benches, chanting multiplication tables in a rhythm that matches the swing of their bodies, while the schoolmaster, rod in hand, watches for minds that wander too far. Slates scrape, quills squeak. A small coal stove in the corner fights a losing battle against the chill that creeps in along the floor. Some of those boys will end up as clerks for merchants, writing ledgers in neat columns and turning the movement of barrels and crates into tidy rows of figures. Some will go on to college in Cambridge, where they will read Greek and Latin and argue about philosophy and theology under brick roofs. Others will leave school early to take up a trade or go to sea. Their letters just good enough to sign their names on a crew list or read the articles of a voyage. But even that little bit of schooling changes the way they see the town. Printed broadsides speak directly to them, pamphlets slip into their hands at taverns and on street corners. Sermons can be weighed not just by sound but by text. Printing presses beat at the heart of this new written Boston. You have seen one up close before, in Edis's shop. A wooden frame, an iron screw, a heavy platen that descends like a deliberate fist onto paper laid over inked type. Two men work it, moving with a practiced dance. One inks the type with balls of wool and leather. The other lays the damp paper, pulls the lever, lifts the sheet with fingers already stained dark. Pages stack up on a table, wet and glistening, the words not yet fully set, like dough that still needs to rise. On some days, these presses are busy with things that look very ordinary: advertisements for lost horses or runaway apprentices, notices of goods for sale, announcements of ships due to sail, sermons that proud ministers wish to see preserved beyond the echo of their own voices. On other days, they pull words from the air that feel sharper, words that prick and sting, essays on the nature of liberty, signed with names or with pseudonyms that will later be famous. Reports of clashes with customs officials, satirical pieces, mocking governors and tax collectors with barbs wrapped in humour. The newspapers have a way of folding the whole world into 4 cramped pages. News from London comes weeks or months late, but it comes wars in distant places, changes of ministers, speeches in Parliament, prices on the London Exchange. Stories from other colonies show up too. Riots in New York, assemblies in Virginia, skirmishes with native nations along the frontier, so that a rope maker's apprentice in Boston can, for the price of a small coin, feel connected to a web of events far beyond his own street. Out beyond the town itself, beyond the tight ring of houses and the busy wharves, lies another part of daily life that you see only when work or chance sends you there. The farms and small villages that feed Boston. Twice a week, wagons and carts arrive from the countryside, wheels crusted with mud or rime, laden with barrels of apples, sacks of grain, bundles of hay, live chickens in wicker cages that complain loudly at every bump in the road. The men and women driving them have already been up for hours by the time they roll into town, dawn chores finished, fires banked, children left in the care of older siblings or grandparents. On those rare days when you are sent out of Boston instead of deeper into it, the space feels almost indecently wide. The road winds between stone walls and fields that change their color with the seasons. Brown furrows in early spring, green waves of grain in summer, shock of corn and stacks of cut hay in autumn, a white sheet of snow in winter. Farmhouses stand back from the road, square and practical, with barns and sheds huddled around them like smaller siblings. Life there is no easier than life in town. You can see it in the stooped backs, the weathered faces, the hands roughened by ploughs and scythes instead of tar and rope. But it has a different rhythm, shaped more by sun and soil than by ship schedules and bell towers. Sometimes on such a road you meet members of the original inhabitants of this land, people whose presence your town is built upon but seldom truly acknowledges. A small group of Wampanoag or Massachusetts people might pass you, walking in single file, carrying baskets or blankets, dressed in a mixture of native clothing and European cast-offs. They might be heading to trade at a town on the edge of Boston's reach, or returning from selling fish or crafts. Between them and the farmers and the townsmen there is a complicated history of treaties and betrayals, wars and uneasy peace, shared knowledge and shared disease, all of it condensed in the way eyes slide away or meet, and then quickly move on. You do not need to understand all of that history to sense its weight. It is there in the names of rivers and hills, in the old trails that still run beneath newer roads, in the stories told in some households about raids and captivities, in others about land bought for a handful of goods, and then fenced off forever. Boston's daily life in the 1700s does not exist in a vacuum. It is the latest layer on a landscape already marked by generations of other lives. When storms come in from the Atlantic, the town shows another face entirely. The air grows heavy and thick, the pressure dropping until your ears feel strangely stuffed. The harbor darkens, and the first distant growl of thunder sends people hurrying to secure shutters, to take in laundry and loose goods, to double-check that roofs and chimneys are ready to be tested. Sailors on ships race to reef sails, shouting to one another over the rising wind. Small boats are pulled up as high as possible on the shore, tied and tied again. Inside the rope walk, you can hear the storm before you see it. The long building shudders slightly as the gusts strike its sides, the old timbers creaking in a language you have almost learned to interpret. Complaints, warnings, grudging acceptance. Rain hammers at the roof and walls, finding every crack and knot, working its way in until small drips appear in familiar spots along the floor, each one quickly marked by a bucket or a rag. Someone makes a joke about the whole place floating away like Noah's Ark. Someone else crosses himself quietly when he thinks nobody is watching. At home, storms reshape the evening. Families gather closer to the hearth, voices naturally dropping as if in respect for the roar outside. Stories are told in a different tone on such nights. Tales of ships lost within sight of the harbor, of houses struck by lightning, of narrow escapes and inexplicable survivals. Children cling a little closer to their mothers, eyes wide, half terrified and half thrilled by the way the sky lights up and the world briefly turns white-blue through the window. Sleep, when it comes, is threaded with the sound of the storm's pulse, and in the morning you wake to streets scattered with broken branches. Maybe a chimney collapsed here, a tree uprooted there, and everyone asking the same question: did you hear how loud it was? Did you see that flash? Did you lose anything? Did everyone in your house come through? This too is daily life. Not just the predictable grind, but the way people recover, again and again, from things they cannot control. Illness, fire, flood, the slow, invisible pressure of distant laws, the sudden, visible arrival of a storm. And always, around all of this, there is talk. Talk in doorways and at wells. Talk in taverns and at market stalls. Talk whispered over shared blankets and shouted across busy streets. Talk about small things. Who is courting whom? Whose cow has gone dry? Whose bread is the best on the street? And about large ones. What Parliament has done now. Whether the governor can be trusted. Whether the soldiers will ever truly go home. You are part of that talk whether you mean to be or not. Your complaints about wages, your offhand remark about a soldier's behavior, your description of a new broadside posted on a corner, these tiny exchanges knit together with hundreds of others to shape what the town believes about itself. You are a single voice in a chorus of thousands, and on most days it feels like your words vanish into the general noise. But sometimes, when you least expect it, you hear your own phrasing come back to you from a stranger's mouth, bent slightly, woven into a larger story, and you realize that even small observations can travel a long way in a place this tightly bound. So you keep living the days, the rope walk days and the market days, the sick days and the storm days, the Sundays that stretch like long narrow bridges between one week and the next. You keep waking in a creaking house on a narrow street in a town that still thinks of itself as a distant outpost of an empire, even as, without quite knowing it, it prepares to become the center of something new. And you, Daniel, the rope maker's apprentice, who has become a rope maker in his own right by now, carry on with your own quiet revolutions, learning to read more fluidly, saving coins in a small hidden box, looking at the soldiers and the merchants and the ministers and wondering, more and more often, not just what will they do, but what will we do, and what will I do? Those are questions for other nights, for other chapters of this story. For now, the day has been long, the wind has died down, the harbour breathes in slow, steady waves beyond the dark line of the wharves, and somewhere in the distance a bell marks the hour. You let the sound wash over you, stretch your aching hands once more, and prepare, as you always do, to fold one more ordinary Boston day into the growing bundle of days that will one day be called history. In the years to come, when people talk about Boston in the 1770s, they will remember the big moments, the sharp, bright flashes that show up in paintings and schoolbooks, the massacre on King Street, the night the harbour turned into a teapot, the first shots fired on country roads west of town. But for you, those moments are stitched into something slower and more complicated, a fabric made mostly of ordinary days, rope walk days and market days and Sunday sermon days, that gradually change their colour without you quite realizing when the shift happened. After the night of the tea, Boston does not wake up the next morning transformed into something completely new. It wakes up cold and a little sore, the way a body does after unexpected exertion. The smell of tea still hangs faintly over the harbour, especially when the wind blows in from the east. And for a while people joke that the fish are half leaves themselves now, that if you catch a cod and boil it, the water will come up brown and faintly bitter. But very quickly the jokes thin out, because word arrives from London, and the mood shifts again. The King and Parliament are not amused. You hear the news in pieces at the rope walk from a sailor just back from England with pockets empty and eyes wide. At the Green Dragon from Edders, reading aloud a letter while men lean in so close their shoulders touch in doorways and at wells, where women talk in low voices as they scrub or stir. Boston will be punished, they say. The harbour will be closed until the tea is paid for. The town meetings will be choked off. Officials will be replaced. Soldiers will come, more of them. The coercive acts they are called in London, as if Parliament is a father with unruly children, and has simply decided to tighten discipline. In Boston they earn another name, the intolerable acts, because there is a sense among people here, not just the loud ones in taverns, but quiet men and women in kitchens and workshops, that a line has finally been crossed. Closing the harbour is not an abstract punishment. You feel it quickly enough in the rope walk. Fewer ships come, fewer orders for cable and line. The long building is suddenly too quiet. Echoes where there should be cursing and laughter and the steady rasp of fibres twisting. Men are sent home early some days or not called in at all. You start dipping into the little hoard of coins you've been saving against some future you couldn't yet name. A shop of your own perhaps, or a small house with its own hearth and door that nobody else has a key to. The market changes too. Stalls that used to groan with imported goods now stand half empty. The prices on whatever is left creep up day by day until you hear arguments turn sharper, see hands tremble as they count out coins. They cannot spare. Poor families feel it first and worst, of course. There are more hollow cheeks, more too thin children sitting on steps with nothing to do because they are too weak to play. But the punishment does something Parliament did not quite intend as well. It wakes the other colonies like a slap across a collective face. Wagons start arriving from inland towns, not just with the usual produce, but with extra loads marked as gifts for the suffering people of Boston. From as far away as Virginia and the Carolinas, money and grain and sheep and rice are gathered and sent north. Ministers talk in their pulpits about the need to stand together. to help brothers and sisters in distress, and sometimes carefully depending on who might be listening. They suggest that perhaps Boston is not merely unlucky, but chosen to bear the first weight of a burden everyone must eventually lift. You hear about a man named Washington from Virginia, sending a large gift of money and words of support, about committees forming in dozens of towns, men corresponding in a growing web of letters that crisscross the continent. People speak of America more often now, not just the colonies, as if what is happening in your narrow streets might be the opening of something broader, for better or worse. Inside the Green Dragon, the air is thick with this new sense of being watched and answered by people you have never met. Maps are unrolled more often. Men trace roads and rivers with ink-stained fingers, talking about New York, Philadelphia, Charleston as if they were neighborhoods instead of distant places. The mood is not triumphant. It is wary, brittle, like the moment before a rope under strain finally gives way. Then comes 1775, and the first spring that feels truly dangerous from its opening breath. Rumours multiply like rats. The British are planning to seize the cannon stored in nearby towns. They will march on Concord. They will arrest Adams and Hancock. They will burn whole villages. Each version grows a little sharper in the telling, and you might discount half of it, if not for the simple fact that the soldiers are clearly preparing for something. You see them drilling more often, hear officers' voices carrying across Boston Common in the pale evening light, watch boats being inspected more closely in the harbour. On the night of April 18th, you are not in any particular secret meeting. You are in your room, mending a shirt by the dim light of a tallow candle, when you hear more commotion than usual in the streets below. Boots, lots of them marching in formation, a neighbour's voice, tight with something like excitement. They're moving tonight. You go to the window. Down on the street, a column of redcoats is moving toward the water, their bayonets making faint little pricks of light as they catch the lantern glow. Across the harbour, in Cambridge and beyond, other men are already waking, already buckling on whatever weapons they own, because the network of riders and signals that has been quietly arranged over the past months has now been set into motion. You hear later about Paul's Ride, about lanterns in a church tower, about farmers leaving ploughs half-turned in fields as they run to join the growing lines. You do not see Lexington and Concord with your own eyes. What you see is Boston the next day. The tight, nervous look on the faces of officers who ride past. The way the soldiers' uniforms are smudged with dust they did not have yesterday. The bandages appearing on arms and heads and cheeks. The whisper that not all who marched out have marched back. Within days, the town is effectively under siege. Armed men, militia, farmers, mechanics, boys who only recently were throwing stones in the street for sport, have gathered in a rough ring outside Boston, cutting off easy land access. The British still hold the town and the harbour, but they are, in a strange way, the ones trapped now, along with everyone who did not get out in time. Daily life bends under this new strain. The Navy controls what comes by sea. The Army controls what moves on land. Food grows scarcer. Prices rise again. Some families whom you once saw walking the common in fine clothes now send servants to market with tight lists and tighter faces. Others have already gone, slipping away before the ring closed, their houses standing empty or rented out, their names still occasionally mentioned over tavern tables with a mixture of envy and contempt. Loyalists, people say, or simply cautious, or simply tired of being in the middle of something that feels increasingly like a storm building over one small patch of ground. One June afternoon you climb to the roof of the boarding house when you hear the cannon. Others are already up there, crowding near the edge. Faces turn toward the peninsula to the north. Smoke rises in thick, dirty plumes from the direction of Charlestown, staining the clear blue of the sky. You can hear the boom of guns, the pop of musket fire riding on the wind, and underneath it a dull roar that might be men shouting, might be something else entirely. Bunker Hill, someone says in a low voice. Or Breeds, someone else corrects. The names don't matter much to you yet. What matters is that you are watching with your own eyes. A battle happening within sight of your own roof. A town across the water burns, you can smell it. Sharp and bitter even here. Later you learn what everyone learns, that the British took the hill but lost so many men doing it, that no one could call it a clean victory. That farmers behind earthworks had stood and fired again until their powder was gone and their bayonets blunt. That blood ran in little red rivulets down slopes. You have walked on calmer days. You also learn that a man you once nodded to at the rope walk, a quiet fellow named Warren, died up there, shot through as he tried to help hold a line that probably never really had a chance. Life in the besieged town grows narrower after that. The soldiers are jumpier, the officers more determined to make an example of anyone who looks like they might become trouble. But the strange thing is that in some ways your days still look almost the same. You wake, you eat what you can, you work when there is work, you talk, you sleep. War creeps in at the edges, but it is not yet the kind that tears the whole fabric apart all at once. Then, in the winter of 1775-76, something changes on the hills around Boston. You hear it before you see it in any clear way. The rumor that cannon have arrived, dragged all the way from a far-off place called Ticonderoga, by a man named Knox, who seems to believe that distance and snow are merely technical difficulties. Soon those rumors turn into distant, credible shapes, long dark barrels pointing down at the town from Dorchester Heights, like fingers of iron laid casually on a throat. In March you wake one morning to find the British suddenly busy in a new frantic way. Wagons creak and shout their way down to the wharves. Soldiers carry crates and barrels, roll wheels, tether horses. Ships are readied, not for a skirmish, but for departure. On March 17th, under a bright, indifferent sky, you stand among thousands of others on the hills above the harbour, and watch the redcoats who have lived among you for years, now file in long lines onto the decks of their transports. It feels unreal, like a childhood dream of giants leaving, taking their noise and their boots and their bright, aggravating colours with them. Yet ships are very real things, and they lift their anchors and spread their sails just as they always have, and with a slowness that is somehow more painful than speed. They move down the channel and out toward the open sea. Some people cheer, some cry, some stand in silence, arms crossed, faces unreadable. You are not sure what you feel. Relief, certainly, that the threat that has weighed on your chest for so long is lifting, at least for the moment. Pride, a little, that the town you live in has done what once seemed impossible, stood up to the most powerful empire in the world and forced it, if not to its knees, then at least to one step backward. But there is something else there too, a hollow awareness that this is not an ending, only the end of one chapter. The soldiers can sail away from Boston. They cannot sail away from the anger and ideas that have now taken root from New Hampshire to Georgia. You have heard talk of a Congress meeting in Philadelphia, of men from all the colonies sitting in one room and debating not just taxes but the nature of government itself. You have heard whispers of words like independence moving from tavern arguments into more serious mouths. Later that summer, someone reads aloud, in the square near Faneuil Hall, a document freshly arrived from that Congress, a declaration they call it, in which the colonies announce to the world that they consider themselves free and independent states. The words fall on your ears with a strange mix of familiarity and shock, because so many of the grievances listed there are things you have felt in your own bones. Armies quartered in your streets, trade choked, laws made with no voice from those they govern. And yet the last step, the final break, still feels like stepping off the edge of a roof in the dark, hoping there is solid ground where you cannot see it. You listen anyway. You listen to phrases that will echo for centuries about self-evident truths, and all men created equal and rights that governments are supposed to protect, not grant, and you feel the hairs on your arms lift as if a cold breeze has passed over them, even in the heat of July. You know that not everyone in this town is truly included in those promises yet. Not the enslaved woman carrying water past the edge of the crowd, not the sailor with dark skin and a scarred face leaning against a post, not the wife standing in a doorway holding a baby while her husband has gone to join the army. But you also know that words once spoken publicly have a way of working on reality like slow, persistent tools. And what about you? You are not a famous name. You are not in the paintings that will be made later, or in the pamphlets that scholars will lean over in quiet libraries. You are a rope maker, your hands scarred and strong, your shoulders shaped by years of walking the length of long tar-scented buildings. You have stood in crowds at the Liberty Tree, in the smoky basement of the Green Dragon, on the hill above the harbour watching ships depart. You have carried news from the docks to men who needed to hear it. You have passed along rumours that turned out to be truths. You have watched friends buried because they were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and also because they believed some things were worth standing for. When the chance comes to enlist, you think about it. You think about the line of men in homespun standing against redcoats at Lexington, about the ragged soldiers on the hill at Charlestown, about Washington's army out in the countryside, half-fed and ill-equipped, trying to turn scattered anger into something disciplined and enduring. In the end, perhaps you go, perhaps you decide your hands are more use making rope for ships that will be needed now more than ever. In the great sweep of things, either choice is small, and either matters. Revolutions are not made only by those who carry muskets. They are also made by those who keep cities breathing while the noise of war moves elsewhere. Years later, when Boston is no longer a British town on the edge of an empire, but a city in a new country that is still trying to decide what kind of nation it wants to be, you will walk along the harbour on some quiet evening and smell, beneath the tar and salt and fish, the ghost of tea leaves and gunpowder and wood smoke. You will pass the place where the rope walk used to stand, or where a newer, larger one has risen in its place, and you will feel your hands twitch slightly, remembering the rhythm of twisting fibers. You will hear the church bells and remember nights when they tolled for funerals and warnings, and days when they rang out in joy. You will see children running in the streets, playing games that have nothing to do with troops or governors, and you will hope fiercely that they never have to smell blood on snow or see their town burn from the rooftop. You will also know, in some quiet corner of yourself, that if they do, they will be no different from you, tired and uneasy, hungry and hopeful, carrying on with their work and their loves and their worries while history moves around them at the speed of an ordinary day. And you, lying in your bed now, centuries away, listening to this story through a thin piece of glass and metal instead of a voice in a tavern, are not so far from Daniel as you might think. You have your own crowded streets and quiet rooms, your own kinds of rope walks and markets and storm nights. You live in a world shaped by people like him, by apprentices and cooks and sailors and enslaved men, and free women whose names you will never know but whose hands helped pull the future a little closer. As your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts loosen and drift, you can let the images soften. The narrow wooden streets of 1760s Boston at dusk, the lanterns swinging gently outside tavern doors, the faint clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, the smell of bread and smoke and sea. Somewhere a young man is walking home with tar on his palms and new ideas in his head. Somewhere a printing press beats its slow, steady rhythm. Somewhere a child is tracing letters on a scrap of paper, practicing the word liberty for the very first time. The harbour is dark now in your mind. The ships at anchor mere shadows against the water, their masts a forest of lines against the stars. The bells of Christ Church have finished their work for the night. Boston sleeps, as it always did between one upheaval and the next. 16,000 souls in straw beds and feather beds, in cramped attics and solid brick houses, in barracks and in back rooms, all breathing in and out, all carried along by days that felt small at the time and turned out to be enormous. You can let them fade now. These streets and these voices, let the creak of rope and the murmur of tavern talk and the distant rush of the tide blur into a single gentle sound. When you wake, the world will be your own again, with its own work and worries, but some part of you will remember what daily life actually looked like in 1700s Boston, not as a list of dates and battles, but as a series of mornings and evenings, of meals and arguments and laughter and fear, lived by people who were in the end just trying to get through one more day. For now, though, there is nothing more you need to do. The story has come to rest. You can close your eyes, breathe out slowly, and let the city on the hill, cold and smoky and sea-swept, full of ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight, fade gently into the dark.